The Birth and Times of Mr. Dystopia. Part 1. Apocalypse at Harpers Lane. Chapter 1. Earth, 1969. Silga and her new mother Annabelle had little to be grateful for while living in the slums of Serbia. They had food, but within their culture lay unrest and violence emerging. Silga's family was no different. Enough, you're scaring Silga. Can you not just explain to me calmly what it is you've gotten yourself into this time? Now you listen here. Woman, the day I decide a man tells his wife all his business is the day I take a pot of boiling water to my testicles. You just keep your goddamn trap shut and be grateful you've got food and a home to eat it in. You know, I'm grateful, it's just I'm worried. I'll starve, I'll live on the streets and still be happy so long as I have my family with me. I'm worried about you, I'm worried about Silga's future and if she's going to have a father or not. You blabbing your mouth isn't going to help that cause, Annabelle. Just clean and fuck like a good wifey and accept what I have given you. On that note, the man leaves, slamming the door on the way out. Annabelle consolidates her daughter, who was quiet on the stairs, having listened to everything. What's happening, Mummy? Is Daddy in trouble? Maybe, dear, maybe. This was the last time they would see Silga's father. Here in Serbia, governments were as blatantly corrupt as gangsters, which meant there wasn't much crime organizations couldn't do. Nonetheless, for many, the government would be the only option for aid. And so, the thin ice they lived on would sometimes break, as it did for Silga's father. It was 3 days since they heard from him. Police came to the door, told the mother in private how a man running the loader at the landfill seen the body, how if it weren't for one remaining finger, they would never have identified him. The officer almost seemed cheerful as he exclaimed a stroke of luck finding the decapitated finger not far from the body. Annabelle did not find this amusing. Oh, and Miss Noel. Yes, I just felt it necessary to warn you the two people your husband dealt with, who he wronged. They're some of the more vicious kind. The kind of people who put everything on reputation, so much so that it would be expected, as they've done before, to come after the wrongdoer's family, to set an example. Do you understand? Yes, you're telling me we're in danger. Correct, ma'am, you are in danger. What am I supposed to do then? Are you going to take us into protective custody? What? No, ma'am. The budget only allows protective custody for severe cases, such as threats to diplomats and what have you. I'm afraid the budget simply does not allow for every suspected dangerous case to qualify for these services. Well, do you not think we are in sufficient danger? Good Lord, I'm surprised you're still here, if I'm to be honest. No, you ought to leave as soon as possible. I mean right away. We can't help you because, well, you're poor. I see. Thank you, officer. You may go now. The officer does just that. Annabelle looks at her daughter. Her scared and wondrous eyes lead Annabelle into a nervous frenzy, feeling as if all was lost. She panics, rushing for her anxiety pills. These pills would fix nothing but numb her long enough to think of what to do. They were her last pills, and so they must count. Now numbed, a sense of euphoria even, Annabelle embraces her daughter, consolidating her. She then remembers an uncle in Montreal. Rushing through the house, she eventually finds a book with a number scribbled on it. While calling, she felt anxious again, thinking, what if he did not answer? He does, however, and to her surprise, tells her she is welcome. Silga and her mother pack up and firstly head to a shop to sell what wares they have. They then proceed with their travels, finding trains and ferries, finally making it penniless in the west coast, Vancouver Island. Here, this tragic family would endure the most, being forced to beg on the streets while Annabelle's mind slowly left herself as she could not cope with her conceived failures. It was also here they would encounter the most important person in their lives, a young professor named Charles D. Isaacs. This young, adventurous spirit always had a fascination for tragedy and the lifestyles they would then emit. He studied this, among other practical sciences such as theoretical cosmology, quantum physics, and experimental psychology. He too believed that various mental abnormalities such as dementia were portals to alternate dimensions which, when understood, could become just as real as waking life. The professor also was a fool for tragic eyes, and inside both Annabelle and Silga Noel carried the most tragic he had ever seen. Inside he could see vast universes dimming as its source faded into antimatter. Sweet, sweet antimatter, the professor would ponder as he gazed upon these creatures. In his perspective, magnificent. Dearest, why on earth do you lay on the streets? And what is wrong with your mother's eyes? Has the life been sucked out of her? Young Silga stared at the strange man incredulously. What a funny man, funny and weird. My father, were quite poor, sir. My mother is sad. Well, I don't suppose being out here on the streets is going to make matters any better. What do you say you bring your mother inside and we get her a cup of tea? What do you say to that, And how about a hot chocolate for yourself? Wouldn't that just be sweet? My mother needs something to eat, sir. And what do we have here? There's still a fire burning in you, isn't there, dear? Yes, come with me and I'll make sure both you and your mother are well fed. And so the professor did just that. Little did he know, this single act of great kindness would lead forth towards a cycle of constant mishap, and that this being would be the ultimate ruler of such a domain. But for now, onwards they went over the years. The professor adopted this family as his own. The professor did this with some ease for his research and further precedent onto the theory of multiverse, dark flow, and reincarnation. He was yet to succeed in any real tangible discovery. However, he had the world on its toes, eager to see if he would deliver on his life's goal to materialize dark matter. All his promises, the professor seized his time. He knew that if he didn't come up with the results, that his funding would be cancelled, and then how would he support his family? His love was pure, but his mission will always be imminent. This is where any man finds himself once turned to desperation and obscured morality. The budget was tight, but this new pressure in some ways released Isaacs. No longer did he worry about the experiment, now it was all about the results. Isaacs now was moving onto human experiments. He had it all planned out. Haven't thought about it in those days of overwhelming frustration. The homeless, yes. It makes perfect sense. Who will miss them? Capture them, drug them, and send them off to space. Isaacs will get his results. Annabelle's mother, despite her progressive worsening, had the occasional conscious day. The day Professor Charles Isaacs walked into the house bloodied and distraught, she grabbed her daughter and took the first train to Montreal. She arrived at her elderly uncle, who brought them back to his home. It was simple, it was generic, and it was safe. Finally, at a loss from his new and only family, Professor Isaacs loses it on his experiments, slaughtering every one of them. He packs his things and leaves for Montreal, where he knows Annabelle's uncle resides. Arriving at the growing city, Isaacs was finally calmed by his only friend and former college peer, Dr. Frederick Ulrich Nelson. The professor confided to the doctor why he was there and why they left. The doctor had become much more interested in why they left. Nelson then told Isaacs what they could do to re-amp his operations there in Montreal. He told him how there was plenty of homeless to be taken, that it'd be a service to the city. He told Isaacs about the abandoned school he bought the deed to, made of brick and with caged windows. Finally, he told him he would help him with his experiment so he may constitute success and ultimately win his family back. This was all a lie. They did all as agreed upon, except one homeless turned out to have had a home. The family called the authorities, who tracked the man's beeper, which he had stashed inside his rectum before stripped of all his belongings. This was a clever man, only he too was a poor man, which is why he found himself where he was. It was as easy as that. Just like the doctor said, people without money will do anything for money. And so this clever man with his clever beeper stuffed inside his rectum, he was found and his captors caught. Not before they performed their most important experiment, Project Compound Paradox. This project was simple. The doctor and professor had consistently dabbled with variations of psychoactive compounds, attempting to create the most potent one while extracting hyperactive brain matter from the patient's pineal gland. This was so they could administer a significant dose along with a second dose of neurophasers, a highly potent compound that induces sleep, that would combine to create the most stimulated pineal gland ever to be recorded and scientifically observed. Finally, when they got the hallucinogen just right, Isaacs went under. While under such a stimulated sleep, the doctor then produced a large syringe, which he broke through the skull into the fleshy gland. As the professor twitched and kicked about, Dr. Nelson extracted the compound paradox. As he did so, he witnessed in amazement the glowing liquid that now resided within the syringe. The police raided the school as the sun rose. Isaacs too woke, and as he watched, he witnessed the first known side effect of the experiment, which was, once active, the participant reacts most violently to the sun, driving them mad with energy while seemingly constantly tortured. Now, with all their dreams and infinite potential condensed into one recipient, the homeless they had experimented on became addicted to the sun to the point of violent outburst. This would quickly become widespread news. Silga and her mother discovered it by people recognizing her. Annabelle had just gotten better when the famed crazed professor made it on the television, confessing his everlasting mission to find his wife Annabelle and their daughter Silga. Harassment began as they became the notorious Psycho's family. Scrutiny for sake of opportunity. This is how the public got off when things were getting dull. This would soon take Annabelle's life. found dead in the bathtub, foaming out the mouth, her wrist also cut. This sight would stay with Silga forever. This would then become the end of the family's time in Montreal. It would be within days to her mother's wake she would run away. East, for they had come from west. West was a direction. He was in that direction, and so the opposite she would call home. Matters became worse when the professor got out. No one had died, and technically all the patients signed up for the procedures. However, this was not deemed appropriate practice, and so the professor was fined and revoked from the title. He now too was, as were his victims, a hobo. However, something had changed from deep within Isaacs. For example, he knew if he went east he would find his daughter. He could not specify where, but he did not argue. A new sense arose from deep within his mind. He was crazy. This much was true. But all his illusions and insanities would take form, for his pineal gland was even crazier than he was, confused in which realm held the fiction and which was his reality. Speaking of illusions, we go now to North Korea, where a young soldier trains to fight and kill what he believes is a world of enemies. These are a funny people, for they are against every single community in the world, even themselves from the south. Regardless of their politics, we follow one young man and his life takes an unexpected turn. It was later in the night. He had just finished training. He was on his way to the showers when he noticed a light outside the building. While pursuing, he strays from the camp and into the forest. However, a few more meters into the bush and everything within his perspective shifted. The green leaves from the trees, the dark, moist bark, all melted away as what eventually would be known as the world as a camouflage hologram lost its effect on the young North Korean. He screamed and yelled, threatened the light, to which sucked him up from the ground. All was futile, for this was a very efficient hologram and none of his peers would hear him. On board the ship, two unknown species questioned the man. He was trapped in what looked like a jar, only without glass. Instead, a different impenetrable form of hologram. The meaning of this abduction was simple. These aliens, eventually known as Greys, are the most closely associated off-planet species, constantly in a state of observation and policing of our planet. They reside from Pluto, whom, with their resources within government, would convince the world it was not a planet, led curious eyes away from their mother's ship. However, like any group of beings, there's always going to be a few mavericks. These two Greys were called X and Y. Convinced that some Earthlings were meddling with forces beyond their control, they too set out to make a name for themselves amongst their peers. Unfortunately for this North Korean, he knew nothing of black holes or molecular simulators, and so they parted him from the world called Earth.